Siglo XX con Mike Wallace.
Hoy en siglo XX, Vietnam. ¿Cómo fuimos a la guerra?
We never knew in Vietnam what we were trying to do.
Comenzó de forma muy modesta, unos cuantos millones de dólares para ayudar a los franceses a combatir a los comunistas vietnamitas decididos a alcanzar su independencia. Pero gradualmente Estados Unidos se involucró cada vez más con Vietnam. Primero con dinero, luego con consejeros militares y finalmente con decenas de soldados. Todo en un inútil esfuerzo por detener lo que Estados Unidos pensaba era la expansión del comunismo.
We left Vietnam a wounded land, and we wounded ourselves too.
Soy Mike Wallace y este es Siglo XX.
Siglo XX con Mike Wallace.
Para la historiadora Barbara Tuchman fue la marcha de la locura. Para David Halberstam, premio Pulitzer, fue la creación de un pantano. Tanto Halberstam como Tuchman se referían a la cadena de acontecimientos que llevó a Estados Unidos a Vietnam, la guerra más criticada de la historia.
The Vietnam War was a totally unwinnable war because you could not stop the other side, which was prepared to go on fighting forever.
En el año 67 esto se hacía más evidente para los analistas militares en Estados Unidos. Aunque las tropas americanas ya habían estado asumiendo la responsabilidad de la guerra durante casi 2 años, los soldados se encontraban aún varados en una frustrante guerra de guerrilla sin poder vislumbrar un final.
And they're watching television night after night, and they're seeing scenes of battles, and they're beginning to look like each other, and they're seeing Americans being carried away in green bags.
Stanley Carnew es el autor del libro Vietnam, una historia.
And what happened in America is a result of this feeling of frustration that all this is not going anywhere, that we're treading water.
El sentimiento de que Estados Unidos estaba arando en el mar y la sensación de frustración llevó a un número creciente de estadounidenses a preguntarse en primer lugar cómo se habían involucrado en esto. La respuesta se encontraba en el pasado cuando los vanidosos franceses intentaron restablecer el control sobre Indochina al final de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. A este intento se opuso el legendario Ho Chi Minh, un comunista vietnamita quien había estado luchando por la independencia de la Primera Guerra Mundial.
We looked upon Ho Chi Minh as a servant, or a vassal, if you will, of Khrushchev and Mao Zedong. He wasn't that. He was a patriot. He was an Asian Tito, and he was leading a civil war, the force of nationalism, and it was far stronger than we understood. We were wrong. We didn't have our history. We didn't have our culture correct.
La guerra francesa contra Ho Chi Minh no prosperó. Por ello pidieron ayuda a Estados Unidos, lo que denominaron lucha contra la agresión comunista.
We looked at the world in the post-war period in black and white.
Neil Sheehan cubrió los primeros años de la guerra para United International.
We didn't see it in grays. We didn't realize that within the so-called communist world, there were all these various movements which had their own agendas. In fact, Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese nationalist, and those who followed him were primarily nationalists. We perceived them as the vanguard of this international communist force, which was going to knock over all of these dominoes one after the other until they were in Japan and then in Hawaii and then they were in California. Literally, I mean, this is the way people thought in those years.
Estados Unidos respondió enviando a los franceses 8 aviones de transporte. Ese fue el comienzo de un compromiso de una década que finalmente costó 58,000 vidas estadounidenses.
A lot of people seem to think that President Kennedy got us involved, or President Eisenhower got us involved, or President Johnson. But in fact, the first steps were taken by President Truman when he decided in 1950 to give the French $15 million. Which is really quite a paltry sum.
Pero aunque la ayuda a los franceses alcanzó $400 millones bajo el mando de Eisenhower, los franceses aún parecían destinados a fracasar. Para marzo del año 54 habían decidido provocar una batalla final en una pequeña aldea de Vietnam occidental llamada Dien Bien Phu.
We stood in Dien Bien Phu. I'll never forget it. It was a little muddy field, and it was shaped something like this. It was in the hollow of my palm here, and all around us were mountain crests, high ridges. The French were located down here in the bowl. They called it La Cuvette, which was a bowl. And I remember some of the correspondents saying to the French general at the time, "But General, what happens if the enemy ever gets up onto the ridge? He's going to be shooting fish in a barrel." And the general looked at that and said, "Oh, yes, but you see, these Vietnamese, these Annamites, they're not very good with artillery like we Europeans are."
What happened was that the Viet Minh, guerrillas, these little guys in sandals and shorts, managed to drag cannon up to the mountain crests around, overlooking the French garrisons down in the valley, and began to pound them. And one by one, the French garrisons began to fall.
Siege of Dien Bien Phu lasts 55 days. On May 7th, the Viet Minh starts its final assault.
I was in the dugout at Hanoi at Supreme Headquarters with General René Cagnier, who was calling Dien Bien Phu. And we could hear the noise of communist guns. We could even hear the screaming of the wounded on that radio communication, until finally we heard the voice of Castro saying, "My general, they're coming in now. All is over. I must cut off." The radio went dead. We heard no more from Dien Bien Phu. It was the end of the garrison. It was the end of the French adventure in Indochina. It was indeed the end of the French Empire.
En conversaciones de paz en Ginebra, Estados Unidos intentó rescatar lo que quedaba de la asombrosa debacle de los franceses.
The Prime Minister of France, Pierre Mendès France, who negotiated the agreement with Ho, realized that Ho Chi Minh was an Asian Tito, in effect. And he tried to persuade the Eisenhower administration, John Foster Dulles and the president, to, in effect, support Ho as an independent force. And we rejected that.
En lugar de ello, Vietnam fue dividido temporalmente. Las dos mitades quedaron separadas por una zona desmilitarizada. Se suponía que en 2 años habría elecciones nacionales que reunificarían al país. El gobierno comunista de Ho Chi Minh tomó control del norte, mientras el sur fue reorganizado bajo el mando de un hombre, No Tin Chien, quien contaba con el apoyo de Washington.
Do you think that what is left of Vietnam can be held?
I certainly do. I think that in the present Premier, Joe Dinh Diem, that we have one man who, if it can be pulled out of the fire, can keep South Vietnam free and independent. He is honest and incorruptible. He is a man of high ideals, and the people are flocking to him.
We thought he was a nationalist. He was, to the extent that he intended to run the country himself, but he had no following because he'd withdrawn himself during the Indochina War. He, in effect, pulled back from both sides and isolated himself. And he was a Catholic, too, you know. Catholics are supposed to be very anti-communist. That made him very attractive to us. It made him very unattractive to the Vietnamese.
Fortalecido por su apoyo en Washington, Diem decidió ignorar el acuerdo de paz de Ginebra.
1956 came along, and the government in the South refused to hold the election because they knew, and everybody assumed, that if the election were held, the chances are the communists would have won.
Diem lanzó entonces una campaña para acabar con los comunistas que quedaban en el sur.
He embarked on a campaign to sort of clean them up, arrest them, execute many of them, and so forth.
There were 8,000 to 10,000 Viet Minh cadres left in the South at the end of the war. And the CIA and the U.S. military mission in Diem started hunting them down and killing them. People were shot. Province chiefs had authority to shoot on suspicion alone. You didn't even have to try somebody. Suspicion was enough to shoot them. And in 57, 58, despite instructions from Hanoi to conduct a peaceful agitation movement against Diem, they said the only way to survive is to fight back. And so they started to fight back, and they started a guerrilla war.
En los últimos días de la administración Eisenhower, Diem pidió ayuda para enfrentar a los comunistas, a quienes llamaba el Viet Cong. El gobierno respondió con millones de dólares de ayuda y varios cientos de consejeros militares para el ejército sudvietnamita. Pero la responsabilidad principal de enfrentar la nueva guerra en Vietnam sería heredada por un nuevo presidente estadounidense.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Para entonces, ese valiente juramento cautivó los corazones de muchos estadounidenses, pero esas palabras serían recordadas después con menos entusiasmo cuando se supo que los soldados debían luchar en las remotas selvas de Vietnam y que el precio que el país pagaría sería de miles de vidas. El compromiso estadounidense en Vietnam cuando regresemos otra vez con siglo XX. En sus primeros meses de gobierno, el presidente John Kennedy tuvo que afrontar problemas de política exterior más urgentes que la amenaza de los comunistas en Vietnam. Pero aún durante las crisis en Cuba y Berlín, Kennedy podía ver ya al sudeste de Asia como el siguiente enfrentamiento entre este y oeste.
We face a challenge in Berlin, but there is also a challenge in Southeast Asia, where the borders are less guarded, the enemy harder to find, and the dangers of communism less apparent to those who have so little.
There were about 800 American military advisors at the end of the Eisenhower administration. By the end of the Kennedy administration, which wasn't a very long administration, there were 16,000. And so the numbers increased. More money was put in to strengthen the South Vietnamese army.
Y mientras llegaban más consejeros militares y ayuda, la guerra entre el ejército sudvietnamita y los comunistas se acentuaba. Eso atrajo la atención de un creciente número de periodistas.
Arvin is fighting a war in the jungles and mud of South Vietnam, a war in which the enemy is usually invisible. American soldiers are teaching Arvin how to fight his war. Since the enemy is communist, that makes it our war too.
We really believe that if we created this American world order within the non-communist world, not all of which would be democratic, but that the ultimate outcome of it would be that we would raise the living standards of people in these areas through the power of the American economy, through American aid, etc. And most of all, we would prevent communism from taking over the whole world and threatening us.
So far, American aid has been small protection against the communist tactic in South Vietnam, guerrilla war. Kill the village chief, kill his deputy, control the village. Every day the terror grows. Uniformed and armed bands of men roam the rice fields and jungles. The government answer to this is to hunt the communists down.
And now we're moving out the 200th Ranger Company of the Vietnamese infantry, moving down through thick woods to the south. That's whistling. I don't know if you can hear it or not, but that's the sound of a 155 millimeter shell going overhead toward the enemy.
All of a sudden there was some firing in the woods right behind us. We've jumped into a trench now. We were watching the planes power diving, and all of a sudden there was firing. This is a confused kind of war. One minute everything is utter peace, and the next minute there's fire right behind you.
Pero independientemente de lo que hicieran los estadounidenses, pese a la cantidad de armamento y consejeros, la guerra continuaba yendo en contra de Vietnam del Sur.
President Kennedy says that the Vietnamese are not quite as committed to their war as we'd like them to be. But how do you get people like these mountain villagers from central Vietnam on your side in an ideological struggle? How do you turn peasants who still hunt with bows and who have never heard of Khrushchev or Berlin or Kennedy into militant anti-communists?
I was a child of the Cold War. I thought this was the right war at the right time in the right place. We didn't believe the war itself was wrong. We thought they were fighting it in the wrong way because we could see that the South Vietnamese army wouldn't fight.
Una de las dificultades pudo haber sido el líder sudvietnamita No Dinh Diem, un hombre que nadie describiría como carismático.
He would sit in his palace, chain smoking, very rarely went out. And he had a kind of old-fashioned, antiquated Mandarin mentality that he was a kind of divine ruler.
The president of South Vietnam is not a politician in the Western sense. He's a remote and solitary man. When he toured a flooded village and reviewed some troops, he didn't get down in the mud to shake any hands. He does not excite his people, he commands.
The Diem regime was hopelessly inept politically. It was alienating its own people, was corrupt.
El aislamiento de Diem y el control de su familia sobre el poder empezó a alejar inclusive a la iglesia budista fuertemente anticomunista.
They were fed up with this Catholic family that was denying them what they thought was a rightful place of influence within the society, which was mainly nominally Buddhist. And so they started a protest movement against the regime. And again, it caught fire because the regime was so unpopular.
This is the symptom and the symbol of the new trouble in Vietnam. Self-immolation, the bizarre and grisly technique the Buddhists developed to catch the eye of the world.
Apartado, fuera de contacto con la deteriorada situación nacional, el régimen de Diem contrarió aún más a la opinión pública cuando Madame Nhu, la esposa del odiado hermano de Diem, jefe de la policía, criticó las protestas budistas.
What have the Buddhist leaders done comparatively? The only thing they have done, they have barbecued one of their monks, whom they have intoxicated, whom they have abused the confidence. And even that barbecuing was done not even with self-sufficient means, because they use imported gasoline.
A finales de ese verano había claras señales de que los oficiales de Washington estaban agotando su paciencia con Diem. De hecho, el presidente Kennedy lo admitió en una entrevista con Walter Cronkite.
I don't think that the war can be won unless the people support the effort. And in my opinion, in the last 2 months, the government has gotten out of touch with the people. The repressions against the Buddhists, we felt, were very unwise. Now, all we can do is to make it very clear that we don't think this is the way to win. It's my hope that this will become increasingly obvious to the government, that they will take steps to try to bring back popular support for this very essential struggle.
Do you think that this government still has time to regain the support of the people?
With changes in policy and perhaps in personnel, I think it can. If it doesn't make those changes, I would think that the chances of winning it would not be very good.
Ese cambio de personal no tardó mucho en ocurrir.
Henry Cabot Lodge was the ambassador, and he convinced President Kennedy that the only hope was to get rid of Diem because we were going to lose with Diem. But if you got a military government in, you had a chance maybe of turning the thing around and winning the war.
So Lodge, behind the scenes, by himself and with essentially one other person, a CIA guy called Lou Conine, began to encourage the plotters, the conspirators, to move against the government.
Así, con apoyo estadounidense, los generales rebeldes sudvietnamitas lanzaron su ataque el 1 de noviembre del año 63 y lograron poner fin de forma abrupta y sangrienta al régimen de Diem.
A coup d'etat, an armed revolt, has broken out in this city against the government of President Ngo Dinh Diem. Two Vietnamese Air Force planes trying to make a rocket run on the palace. Troops hugging the walls of houses, the zing and whine of ricochet. The Vietnamese Marines are spearheading the assault. Plus paratroopers. Diem's palace is burning. Mortars. The Marines are going in now. Here they go. They're running and dodging for the palace gate. The gates are locked, so it's up and over the side, over the iron grill. The palace has fallen. The Marines are in. The prisoners are lined up with their hands in the air.
Just after 6:30 in the morning, Saturday, Saigon time, a white flag fluttered out a window of the presidential palace, and the shooting ceased.
Out go the government pamphlets, the propaganda, the leaflets. Down comes the picture of No Din Diem, and it's ripped and spat upon outside.
No one has said officially what happened to the two men who held out there so long, President Diem and his brother and advisor. The story in Saigon is that they escaped from this palace through a tunnel, perhaps dressed as Catholic priests, and then were seized by soldiers 3 hours later in a Catholic church. President Diem killed by gunfire, his brother killed by stabbing. That is the unofficial version.
La versión popular pronto se hizo oficial. Los líderes del golpe admitieron que Diem y su hermano habían sido asesinados. Eso no formaba parte del plan aprobado por Estados Unidos.
President Kennedy was mortified that the United States should actually be accomplice in a way in the assassination of not only a foreign leader but an ally or a client.
Whatever is done against Vietnam will be felt in America too. To kill or to subdue is easy. But what will happen afterwards?
Antes de que nadie en Washington pudiera afrontar las consecuencias del sangriento golpe, el gobierno de Kennedy llegó a un repentino y trágico final.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
El golpe, seguido por el asesinato del presidente Kennedy, cambió radicalmente el curso de la guerra en Vietnam. La historia cuando regresemos con Siglo XX. El asesinato de Kennedy dejó muchas interrogantes en torno a lo que hubiera ocurrido si hubiera vivido. De todas ellas, la más importante es sobre Vietnam. ¿Habría retirado las tropas al desintegrarse Vietnam del Sur tras la muerte de Diem? ¿O habría continuado con la intensificación del conflicto? El arquitecto de la política de intensificación de la guerra, Robert McNamara, no tenía dudas.
6 weeks before he died, he authorized a statement based on my recommendation to him that we would plan to withdraw all U.S. military personnel, there were then 16,000 there, by the end of 1965, and as a beginning step, we would withdraw 1,000 within 90 days, that is, before the end of 1963, and we did. I think he would have continued that.
Pero si esa era la intención de Kennedy, nunca la hizo pública. Le dijo a Walter Cronkite que, pese a sus reservas sobre el gobierno de Saigón, su causa era justa.
These people who say that we ought to withdraw from Vietnam are wholly wrong, because if we withdrew from Vietnam, the communists would control Vietnam. Pretty soon, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya would go, and all of Southeast Asia would be under the control of the communists and under the domination of the Chinese. And then India, Burma would be the next target.
Had he withdrawn, as I believe he would have believed the danger of the dominoes falling, the danger that the communists, by our failure in Vietnam, would control Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and strengthen their pressure on Western Europe. He would have believed that danger was very great indeed, greater than it now appears it would have been. But even in the face of that, I think he would have withdrawn.
Las memorias de McNamara, recopiladas en el año 95, eran parte de su famosa mea culpa, su disculpa pública por el importante papel que desempeñó al involucrar a Estados Unidos con Vietnam. 30 años antes, había ofrecido un fuerte apoyo al nuevo gobierno sudvietnamita encabezado por el general Dien Can.
The position of my government is clear. We fully support General Khan. We fully support his government. We fully support the people of South Vietnam. We are prepared to furnish whatever economic aid, whatever military training and logistical support, whatever military equipment is required, in whatever quantities are required, and for as long as that is required. Vietnam Mo Nam! Vietnam, Mo Nam! Vietnam, Mo Nam!
McNamara dio su entusiasta respaldo durante una misión en Vietnam del Sur en nombre del nuevo presidente Lyndon Johnson. Al menos en apariencia, el nuevo líder sudvietnamita parecía promisorio.
If South Vietnam has a man of the hour, it is General Nguyen Thanh, the 37-year-old Corps commander who toppled the generals who toppled President Ngo Dinh Diem. In the short time since he proclaimed himself Prime Minister on February 8th, he has behaved more as though he were running for office than that he had seized it, touring slums, patting children on the head, handing out New Year's largesse. Khan seems to show that he realizes the war in Vietnam is, as the American Army Chief of Staff said more than a year ago, 30% military and 70% political.
Pero los estadounidenses comenzaban a notar que en Vietnam las apariencias casi siempre engañaban. Detrás de sonrisas y aplausos, la situación era en todo caso peor que bajo el régimen de Diem.
This is the fourth day of nationwide demonstrations against the government. No one believes the students are acting independently. In the background are the Buddhist leaders, a coterie of politicians, and some of Khan's fellow officers. It adds up to the kind of intrigue commonplace in Vietnam.
So the chaos that started under Diem with the Buddhist crisis began to unroll faster under these military regimes as the South Vietnamese government started to lose in the countryside at the same time, and the Viet Cong started to get stronger and stronger with American weapons, you see, because the American military mission, at the behest of its commanding general, was passing out all these modern weapons, which the guerrillas were capturing from the Saigon forces.
This is part of the $2 million a day bill which America is paying for the war in Vietnam. For 3 years, the United States has been pouring men, money, and supplies into South Vietnam. There are now enough weapons in the country to equip every fighting man on both sides. What's lacking is a government that can inspire the will to win. And you can't buy that, and it doesn't come off ships.
La guerra llevaba ya 4 años y para quienes observaban desde Occidente continuaba siendo un conflicto lleno de confusión.
Are these bona fide Viet Cong or the frightened population of 2 hamlets, or both? The biggest question remains. If everybody here is a Viet Cong, do you arrest the entire hamlet population? The answer is no, only 109 of them. This was a borderline village controlled by the Viet Cong at night, accessible to government troops by day. Most of the fighting in Vietnam does not involve planes or helicopters or even battalions. Just small groups of men stalking and ambushing each other in jungle, swamp, and rice paddy.
Sin embargo, quien hubiera oído a los oficiales en Washington habría pensado que la consecución de la victoria por los sudvietnamitas era solo cuestión de tiempo.
There is no question in my mind that it can be won. It can be won, and we propose to help the Vietnamese to win it.
You would have the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, for example, others, standing up, giving press conferences, saying that everything is going great, everything's marvelous, we're winning the war. Privately, they're sending memos to the president saying, situation is terrible.
This is the Battle of Hung Ne. The paratroop commander is in the thick of the fighting, and he's wounded early. So are other government troops, scores of them. The trap that was laid for the Viet Cong somehow does not close. More dead and wounded. The Vietnamese government claims this was a victory in which 110 Viet Cong were killed. But the unpleasant truth is that no American can confirm one single Viet Cong death. Not a single Viet Cong body was found or photographed.
No eran malas noticias de Vietnam lo que Lyndon Johnson quería escuchar en la víspera de las elecciones presidenciales.
Johnson was not a foreign policy type guy, but as the war continued in Vietnam and escalated, he also did not want to be the first American president in history to lose a war. And he didn't want to be the first American president in history to lose a war to communists.
El adversario republicano de Johnson, Barry Goldwater, era un conservador fuertemente anticomunista.
Barry Goldwater was denouncing Johnson for being soft on communism.
Not to cringe before the bullying of communism.
Johnson pronto encontró cómo responder a las críticas de Goldwater. El 2 de agosto hubo un intercambio de fuego en el Golfo de Tonkin entre un destructor estadounidense y 3 botes PT norvietnamitas. La confrontación no tuvo grandes repercusiones.
But Lyndon Johnson sent another destroyer in there called the Turner Joy. And a few days later, on a stormy night, a report comes in that the communists attacked that destroyer as well.
Esta vez el gobierno reaccionó.
Renewed hostile actions have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
The carriers Ticonderoga and Constellation launched 64 attack sorties against 4 North Vietnamese patrol boat bases and a major oil storage depot. At least 25 North Vietnamese patrol boats destroyed or damaged. Our losses, 2 aircraft destroyed and 2 damaged.
Era la primera vez que aviones estadounidenses bombardeaban Vietnam del Norte. No sería la última. En los años siguientes hubo versiones encontradas sobre lo que en realidad había ocurrido en el Golfo de Tonkin esa noche.
The officer in charge of the destroyer division, which included the Maddox and the Turner Joy, was on board the Maddox that night. He's Captain John Herrick, Annapolis, 1943, still on active duty.
The uncertainty is due to the fact that it was night, it was dark, and we didn't really eyeball these boats. We did have witnesses, eyeball witnesses on the Turner Joy. I consider them dependable witnesses. However, there are people that still doubt that what they saw was boats. I do not. We had sensors who sighted the boats on radar. We had sonar that picked up noise spokes in the water.
Tell me, do you think that night, August 4th, in the pitch black, in a heavy swell, rainstorms, was there anything to shoot at out there?
No, I don't. I'm certain that there was not anything to shoot at right from the beginning.
The man in charge of the main gun director, August 4th, 1964, was a 4-year veteran. He was also an expert sonar man, Patrick Park.
The captain asked me immediately after the attack to go down and evaluate all the recordings that had been made of noise that sonar was reporting. And I kept myself pretty busy for the next 3 days, really, trying to evaluate these things and determine if we had heard anything that might have been even a question mark, that it might have been a torpedo or anything else in the water not related to the 2 ships or noise of either one of them.
And what was your evaluation?
Absolutely nothing.
Aunque la conclusión fue que nada había ocurrido esa confusa noche en el Golfo de Tonkin, el supuesto incidente sí tuvo consecuencias a muchos niveles.
I shall immediately request the Congress to pass a resolution making it clear that our government is united in its determination to take all necessary measures in support of freedom and in defense of peace in Southeast Asia.
El Congreso aprobó por un amplio margen lo que sería conocido como la Resolución del Golfo de Tonkin. La medida otorgó poder al presidente para prevenir futuras agresiones de los norvietnamitas y para evitar que Vietnam del Sur cayera bajo el régimen comunista. Aunque no era una declaración de guerra, la resolución cumplió básicamente el mismo propósito.
What Lyndon Johnson wanted from Congress was a bipartisan resolution that would give him this power and diffuse, eliminate the whole criticism from Goldwater.
La resolución fue apoyada por el presidente de la Comisión del Senado para las Relaciones Exteriores, J. William Fulbright, quien luego sería uno de los mayores críticos de la guerra.
The president, you remember, was in the midst of a campaign for the presidency. His platform was, I'm against the widening of the war. He used to say in his speeches, I am not about to send American boys to Asia to fight the battles that Asian boys should fight, and similar statements. Barry Goldwater was supposed to be the warmonger and the hawk. And this is one reason I was taken in. I was supporting the idea of Johnson. So a declaration of war is just the opposite of what this was represented to be. This was a resolution to prevent a war. Now, I think if he'd come in for a war, the country would have been shocked. I don't think they had any idea of going to war in this way.
Congress gave us this authority in August 1964 to do whatever may be necessary. That's pretty far-reaching. That's the sky's the limit.
El cielo era pues el límite. El presidente Johnson usó la resolución del Golfo de Tonkin para transformar todo el conflicto en una guerra a gran escala. Esa parte de la historia cuando siglo XX, caos y la anarquía reinante en Vietnam del Sur después del asesinato de Diem aceleraron el crecimiento del frente insurgente comunista.
They struck in the countryside in November right after the coup and swept away much of the government military presence in the Delta.
La lenta pero progresiva desintegración del ejército sudvietnamita empeoró los problemas del gobierno.
It was a feckless, hopeless army. It was badly led by corrupt officers, mismanaged.
The men were mercenaries. They joined for something to eat and because they thought it would be easy. They didn't have a cause like the guerrillas did. They weren't fighting for the independence of Vietnam, which the guerrillas were convinced they were doing, and they were doing.
A medida que la guerrilla iba creciendo en tamaño y aumentaba su confianza, se hacía cada vez más audaz. El ejército estadounidense era ahora el blanco principal de sus ataques, como este en la víspera de Navidad del año 64.
This is the Viet Cong Christmas present to the Americans in Saigon. A plastic bomb which exploded here, a senior officer's billet in the center of Saigon.
Can you tell us what happened?
Well, I was down about 2 blocks here and heard the thing go off, so I came running up and went in the place, and that's about all I know. It looked like the bomb went off.
How many
there.
casualties do you think?
Well, I don't know. A lot of people were cut up. We took one gentleman out of a room that was buried underneath there, but he was all right, just blacked
Any
up.
dead?
No, not that I know of. I couldn't comment on it. I don't know. I didn't see any. I saw none. Just people cut up, that was all.
De hecho, 2 estadounidenses murieron en la explosión y otros 65 resultaron heridos. El ataque demostró claramente que el Vietcong era capaz de llevar la guerra al centro mismo de Saigón. Lyndon Johnson, quien acababa de vencer abrumadoramente a Barry Goldwater, sabía que algo debía hacerse para detener el deterioro en Vietnam del Sur.
Johnson's very prudent. He's not sure he wants to get involved in what he used to call this pissant little country. Still, he had his priorities at home.
Pero la creciente osadía del Vietcong convenció a Johnson de que debía actuar.
In February 1965, there was an enemy communist attack against an American installation.
Good evening. This is a special report on what happened today in Vietnam and on the crisis the world is facing there tonight. It is a crisis brought on by a few men, a handful of communist guerrillas who attacked the American air base, Camp Holloway, at Pleiku in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam. 7 Americans were killed, 109 were injured.
Johnson, at that point, decided he had to retaliate. The pressure was too great on him.
In Washington, President Johnson called the National Security Council into session last night and then ordered United States Navy jets to retaliate. This morning, 49 planes from U.S. Navy carriers streaked across the 17th parallel into North Vietnam and bombed a communist troop staging area at Dong Hoi.
Ese bombardeo marcó el comienzo de la larga guerra aérea contra Vietnam del Norte. Entonces, en marzo, Johnson envió aún más refuerzos, un contingente de 3.500 soldados para proteger la gran base aérea estadounidense de Da Nang.
2 reinforced battalions were landed, a total of more than 3,500 men. They are the first actual ground combat troops to enter the country. All other American military men are technically classified as advisors.
They set up a defense perimeter around the airfield, and then they begin to move out. And now we begin to get into the ground war in a very small way.
By planting the boots of the infantry on the sands of Vietnam, we at last admit that this is an American war. There is not a senior officer in the country who would disagree.
There you go.
And many predict that we are here to stay, war or peace.
La intervención no llegó muy a tiempo para los generales que gobernaban el país. El Vietcong avanzaba.
By 65, they captured American weapons. They armed themselves with American weapons. And when you made contact with these people, it was a little drum fire of automatic weapons. And they formed not only just regiments, by that time they'd formed divisions. And within 6 months, they would have taken over South Vietnam.
El crecimiento de las fuerzas estadounidenses en Vietnam durante 1965 fue enorme. Al comenzar el año había 20.000 soldados estadounidenses en Vietnam del Sur. Para finales de ese año ya había 190.000 y la cifra alcanzaría a la larga más de 500.000. Con cada escalada venían las aseveraciones optimistas de que el comando estadounidense contaba ahora con los recursos necesarios para vencer a los comunistas.
The price they're paying is increasing. At some point it'll reach a level they're unwilling to pay. At that point they'll stop and they'll withdraw.
I asked General Giap, who was the communist commander, what kind of losses were you willing to take? He says, unlimited, as long as, we would go on fighting for years, 10, 20, 50, 100 years. This is a sacred cause for us. We never understood that.
En realidad, Estados Unidos intentó librar una guerra convencional contra un enemigo no convencional y no funcionó. Al igual que los franceses que los precedieron, los soldados estadounidenses se vieron a sí mismos sumidos en una batalla sin frentes, en una guerra donde era imposible distinguir a los amigos de los enemigos. Y cuando los reportajes televisivos empezaron a llegar a diario a los hogares, ninguna historia mostró mejor la naturaleza perturbadora de la guerra en Vietnam que la descripción de Morley Safer de un ataque sobre un caserío llamado Cam Ne. Una imagen duradera, un soldado estadounidense intentando incendiar con su encendedor la vivienda de un campesino.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about. The old and the very young. The Marines have burned this old couple's cottage because fire was coming from here.
It first appeared that the Marines had been sniped at and that a few houses were made to pay. Shortly after, an officer told me he had orders to go in and level the string of hamlets that surrounds Cam Ne village. And all around the common paddy field that feeds these hamlets, a ring of fire. 150 homes were leveled in retaliation for a burst of gunfire. In Vietnam, like everywhere else in Asia, property, a home, is everything. A man lives with his family on ancestral land. His parents are buried nearby. Their spirit is part of his holding. The day's operation burned down 150 houses, wounded 3 women, killed 1 baby, wounded 1 Marine, and netted these 4 prisoners. 4 old men who could not answer questions put to them in English. 4 old men who had no idea what an ID card was. Today's operation is the frustration of Vietnam in miniature. There is little doubt that American firepower can win a military victory here. But to a Vietnamese peasant whose home means a lifetime of backbreaking labor, it will take more than presidential promises to convince him that we are on his side.
En los años siguientes se conocerían otras imágenes crudas de la guerra en Vietnam, como la foto de una vietnamita corriendo desnuda por una calle mientras su cuerpo se quemaba con napalm, y conoceríamos de la matanza de niños y mujeres en My Lai y otras masacres sin sentido. Cam Ne fue el primer reportaje en sugerir la verdad que la guerra de Vietnam revelaría sobre Estados Unidos.
We're capable of doing evil as well as doing good.
Algunas conclusiones cuando regresemos con siglo. En 1965, cuando los estadounidenses entraron a Vietnam, una ola de euforia bañó al Pentágono y al comando americano en Saigón. Cuando Estados Unidos pasó a ser más que un simple consejero, se asumía que su fuerza y liderazgo militar alcanzaría una pronta victoria sobre los comunistas. Los chicos regresarán en Navidad. Era el refrán de ese verano.
That was our delusion, to think that we were going to do any better than anybody else. We did, but in the end, it was all futile.
Pero la frustración no vino hasta después, mucho después. En el año 65 ni siquiera los más pesimistas habrían podido anticipar la tragedia aún por venir. No habrían podido ver que pasarían 8 navidades todavía antes de que Estados Unidos lograra librarse de la guerra de Vietnam. Para todos los que vivieron el drama, Desde las promesas hasta la oscura tragedia, fue una dura y amarga lección en los límites del poder americano.
We think someday we'll triumph and this will be a better country for our coming. And it wasn't. We didn't triumph and we left Vietnam a wounded land. And we wounded ourselves too.
Muchos años después, muchas de las heridas de la pesadilla vivida en Vietnam aún no han sanado. Soy Mike Wallace y este es Siglo XX.
Siglo XX con Mike Wallace.